Section 8 of Madame de Staël by Bella Duffy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 6. Madame de Staël retires to Coppet. Madame de Staël arrived at Coppet about the beginning of September 1792. The life there, after her recent experiences in Paris, so far from seeming to her one of welcome rest, fretted her ardent spirit almost beyond endurance. She longed to be back in France, even under the shadow of the guillotine, anywhere but in front of the lake with its inexorable beauty and maddening calm. "The whole of Switzerland inspires me with magnificent horror," she wrote to her husband, who was still in Sweden. "Sometimes I think that if I were in Paris with a title which they would be forced to respect, I might be of some use to a number of individuals, and with that hope I would brave anything. I perceive with some pain that the thing which least suits me in the world is this peaceful and rustic life. I have put down my horses for economy's sake, and because I feel my solitude less when I do not see anybody." By anybody it is to be presumed that she meant the good Swiss, whose expressions of horror, doubtless as monotonous as reiterated, must have been irritating to one whose single desire, night and day, was to cast herself into the arena, there to combat and to save. One outlet she found for her activity in perpetual plans for enabling her friends, and often her enemies, to escape from Paris. The scheme which she projected was to find some man or woman, as the case might be, who would enter France with Swiss passports, certificates, etc., and after getting these properly visés, would hand them over to the person who was to be saved. Nothing could be simpler, Madame de Staël averred, and as she provided money, time, thought, energy, and presumably infected her agents with a little of her own enthusiasm, her efforts were often successful. Among those who engaged her attention was Mathieu de Montmorency, François de Jaucourt, the Princess de Poix, and Madame de Simiane. Among the people whom she saved, and whose rescue she records with the most complacency, is that of young Achille du Chayla. He was a nephew of de Jaucourt, and was residing at Coppet under a Swedish name. Madame de Staël had lent herself to many friendly devices of that kind. The news came that du Chayla, when trying to escape across the frontier under cover of a Swiss passport, had been arrested at a frontier town on suspicion of being what he truly was, a refugee Frenchman. Nevertheless, the authorities declared themselves willing to release him if the Lieutenant Baillival of Nyons would attest that he was Swiss. What was to be done? To bring Monsieur Reverdil, the functionary aforesaid, to such a declaration seemed well nigh hopeless, and Jaucourt was in despair. His nephew, if once his identity were discovered, had no chance of escape from death, for not only was his name on the list of the suspected ones, but his father actually held a command under Condé's banner. This was one of the opportunities in which Madame de Staël delighted. Her spirits rose at once in the face of such difficulties. Fortunately, Monsieur Reverdil was an old friend of her family. She believed that she would be able to melt him, and she hurried away to try. The task was more arduous than she had anticipated. Monsieur Reverdil, by her own confession, one of the most enlightened of Swiss magistrates, turned out to have a sturdy conscience and an uncomfortable amount of common sense. He represented to his ardent visitor, first, that he would be wrong in uttering a falsehood for any motive; next, that in his official position he might compromise his country by making a false attestation. "If the truth be discovered," he urged, "we shall no longer have the right of claiming our own compatriots when arrested in France, and thus I should jeopardize the interest of those who are confided to me for the sake of saving a man toward whom I have no duties." Monsieur Reverdil's arguments had a very plausible side, Madame de Staël allowed, thus much herself, but the good man little knew with whom he had to deal if he thought that such cold justice would have the least effect on his petitioner. She swept all paltry considerations as to the remote danger of unknown, unromantic Swiss burghers to the winds. Her object was to bring back to Jaucourt the assurance of his young nephew's safety, and from this no abstract principles could turn her. She remained 2 hours with M. Reverdil, arguing, entreating, imploring. The task she proposed to herself was, in her own words, to vanquish his conscience by his humanity. He remained inflexible for a long while, but his visitor reiterated to him, "If you say no, an only son, a man without reproach, will be assassinated within 24 hours, and your simple word will have killed him." He ultimately succumbed. Madame de Staël says that it was his emotion that triumphed. It is just possible that it was sheer physical exhaustion. Madame de Staël was at no time a quiet person to deal with. When excited, as in the present instance, she must have been overpowering. It was shortly after these events that Madame de Staël visited England, and while there went to Mickleham, there to be introduced to, and for a time to captivate, Fanny Burney. Except Talleyrand, she was the most illustrious of the brilliant band of exiles gathered together at Juniper Hall, and familiar to all readers of the memoirs of Madame d'Arblay and the journal of Mrs. Phillips. It is well known how Fanny withdrew from her intimacy with the future author of Corinne on learning the stories which connected the latter's name with Narbonne. Mrs. Phillips herself was much more indulgent, and Madame de Staël appears to have felt a grateful liking for her, but it is evident that she was deeply hurt at Fanny's coldness. The approbation of a nature so narrow could hardly have affected her much, one would think, and yet it is plain that she longed for it. She longed, indeed, all her life for such things as she possessed not. She could sacrifice her wishes at all times generously and unregretfully, but she never knew how to bear being denied one of them. In all the glimpses one obtains of Madame de Staël in different countries and from different people, she never seems quite so womanly, so imperfect, and yet so pathetic as in these journals of Mrs. Phillips. Perhaps the reason of it is that one divines in her at this time a sentiment which, if erring, was simple and true, while many of her later sorrows gained a kind of factitious grandeur from the train of political circumstances attending on them. Mrs. Phillips was present when Madame de Staël received the letter which summoned her to rejoin her husband at Coppet, and relates the effect produced upon her. She was most frankly inconsolable, spoke again and again of her sorrow at going, and made endless entreaties to Mrs. Phillips to attend to the wants, spirits, and affairs of the friends whom she was leaving. She even charged her with a message of forgiveness for the ungrateful Fanny, and fairly sobbed when parting with Mrs. Folk. Madame de Staël did not leave Coppet again until after the Revolution. Her life seems to have passed with a monotony that the long drama of horror, slowly culminating in Paris, rendered tragically sombre. She continued her efforts, every day more difficult of accomplishment and sterile of results, to save her friends and foes, and when the Queen was arraigned, she wrote in a few days that eloquent and well-known defence of her, which called down upon the writer the applause of every generous heart in Europe. The Neckers during this period seem to have seen very little society. Gibbon was almost their only friend, and in 1794 he went to England, and a few months later died. The next to go was Madame Necker herself. She had long been ill, and her last few months of life were embittered by cruel pain. She had prepared for her end with the minute and morbid care that might have been expected from her. The tomb at Coppet, in which she rests together with her husband and daughter, was built in conformity with her wishes, and in great part under her eyes. She died on the 6th of May, 1794. Monsieur Necker felt her death acutely, and for months not even his daughter's sympathy could console him. Madame Necker had one of those self-tormenting natures which poison the existence of others in embittering their own. Too noble to be slighted, and too exacting to be appeased, they work out the doom of unachieved desires, and when they go to be wrapped in eternal mystery, their parting gift to their loved ones is a vague remorse and doubting. Silent themselves when they might have spoken, they leave an unanswered question in the hearts of their survivors. Monsieur Necker, with his exaggerated consciousness, must have asked himself repeatedly if he had cared for his strange and loving wife enough. Madame de Stael mourned her mother sincerely, but it is clear that the keenest edge of her grief came from contemplation of her father's. 3 months had not elapsed after Madame Necker's death when the 9th of Thermidor dawned, and at its close, all sanguinary as that appalling termination was, France drew one long sigh of inconceivable relief, for Robespierre had fallen. The Directory followed, and Baron de Stael having been renominated to his post, his wife lost no time in hurrying back to Paris. There, true to her indefatigable self, she immediately set about obtaining the eradication of her friends' names from the list of the proscribed émigrés. From this moment her opinions, and with them her character, underwent a certain change. She had been a moderate royalist; she became avowedly a republican. But her republicanism was of a strangely abstract and eclectic sort, and it was dashed with so many personal leanings towards monarchists that it resulted in nothing better than a spirit of intrigue. She could not understand that the law, whatever it may be, which governs circumstances, makes no account of individuals. She believed that by causing Mathieu de Montmorency and Talleyrand to be recalled from exile, and inspiring Benjamin Constant with the loftiest ideals, she could obliterate the blood-stained past and reverse the logic of events. When everybody, that is, whom she cared about, should have been restored to peace, prosperity, and the air of France, she conceived that the study of metaphysical systems and the cultivation of the affections would alone be needed to remodel and perfect humanity. With this in view, she toiled and plodded unceasingly, clasping the hands of regicides like Barras, rubbing skirts with such women as Tallien, and sacrificing her own pet ideal of womanly duty, which consisted, as she repeatedly proclaimed, in loving and being loved, and leaving the jarring strife of politics to men. Had she remained in France, she must inevitably have been betrayed into greater inconsistency still. But fortunately for her fame, her intellect, and her character, the period was approaching in which Bonaparte's aversion was to condemn her to a decade of illustrious exile. End of Section 8. Section 9 of Madame de Stael by Bella Duffy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. The Transformed Capital, Part 1. In all its varied story, the world probably never offered a stranger spectacle than that presented by Paris when Madame de Stael returned to it in 1795. The mixture of classes was only equalled by the confusion of opinions, and these in their turn were proclaimed by the oddest contrasts in costumes. Muscadins in grey coats and green cravats twirled their canes insolently in the faces of wearers of greasy carmagnoles, while the powdered pigtails of reactionaries announced the aristocratic contempt of their wearers for the close-cropped heads of the Jacobins. To the squalid orgies in the streets, illuminated by stinking oil lamps and varied by the rumble of the tumbrils, had succeeded the salon where Josephine Beauharnais displayed her Creole grace, and Notre Dame de Thermidor sought to wield the social sceptre of decapitated princesses. Although royalism had revived, although furtively, and fans on which the name of the coming king could be read but by initiated eyes were passed from hand to hand in the cafes of Coblentz, a strange, light-hearted, nervous gaiety, intoxicating as champagne, had dissipated the lurid gloom of the Terror. The dumbness of horror had given way to a reckless contempt for tyranny. A sordid, demented mania for speculation had invaded all classes, and refined and delicate women trafficked in pounds of sugar or yards of cloth. An enormous sensation was produced by Ducancel's Nouveau Aristide ou l'intérieur des comités révolutionnaires, a comedy in which its author distilled into every line the hoarded bitterness of his soul against the Jacobins. Barras flaunted his cynical sensuality and shameless waste in the face of a bankrupt society, and austere revolutionaries, beguiled into the enervating atmosphere of the gilded salon, sold their principles with a stroke of the same pen that restored some illustrious proscribed one to his family. Every one of us was soliciting the return of some émigré among his friends, writes Madame de Staël. I obtained several recalls at this period, and in consequence the Deputy Legendre, almost a man of the people, denounced me from the tribune of the Convention. The influence of women and the power of good society seemed very dangerous to those who were excluded, but whose colleagues were invited to be seduced. One saw on Decadis, for Sundays existed no longer, all the elements of the old and new regime united but not reconciled. Into this seething world Madame de Staël threw herself with characteristic activity. Legendre's attack upon her, foiled by Barras, could not deter her from interference. Her mind being fixed upon some ideal republic, she was anxious to blot out all record of past intolerance. The prospect of restoring an aristocrat to his home, or of shielding him from fresh dangers, invariably proved irresistible to her. Nevertheless, she was quick to perceive and to signalize the folly of the reactionaries, and she felt but scant sympathy with the mad attempt at a monarchical restoration known in history as the 13th Vendémiaire. She uttered no word of palliation for the massacres committed by the Royalists in Lyons and Marseille, and she was more than willing to admit the benefits conferred on France by the first 6 months of the government of the Directory. But she could not be happy at the continued exclusion of the nobles and clericals, and any appeal from one of them touched her with all the force of old association. Talleyrand had not returned from America when her eloquence induced Chénier to address the Convention in favor of his recall. Montesquion next claimed her attention, and in consequence of all this she became an object of suspicion and was accused of exciting revolt. The government, indeed, thought her so dangerous that at one moment, when she was at Coppet, they ordered her to be arrested and brought to Paris, there to be imprisoned. Barras, however, defended her, as she relates, with warmth and generosity, and thanks to him she was enabled to return a free agent to France. Throughout the events preceding the coup d'état of the 18th Fructidor, Madame de Staël was keenly alive to the danger which threatened and eventually overtook her friends among the moderates. To act in these circumstances was with her a second nature. Her relations with Barras had naturally become very friendly, and she used her influence to obtain the nomination of Talleyrand to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. His nomination was the only part that I took in the crisis preceding the 18th Fructidor, and which I hoped by such means to avert," she wrote. One was justified in hoping that the intelligence of M. de Talleyrand would bring about a reconciliation between the two parties. Since then I have not had the least share in the different phases of his political career." There is a ring of disappointment in these words, but how could Madame de Stael, with her supposed infallible insight, ever have believed in such a nature? "It is necessary to serve some one," was the answer of a noble when reproached for accepting the office of Chamberlain to one of Napoleon's sisters. Madame de Stael records the reply with scorn, but she should, one thinks, have recognized the fibre of just such a man in the Bishop of Autun. The proscription extending on all sides after the 18th Fructidor, Madame de Stael's intervention became unceasing. She learnt the danger incurred by Dupont de Nemours, according to her, the most chivalrous champion of liberty France possessed, and straightway she betook herself to Chénier, who 2 years previously had made the speech to which Talleyrand owed his recall. Her eloquence soon fired the nervous, violent-natured, but imaginative author, and hurrying to the tribune, he succeeded in saving Dupont de Nemours by representing him as a man of 80, whereas he was barely 60. This device displeased the very person in whose favour it was adopted, but Madame de Stael saved her friends in spite of themselves. So much energy could not be displayed with impunity, and the Committee of Public Safety caused a hint to be conveyed to the Baron de Stael, which induced his wife to retire for a short time to the country. According to Thibaudeau, indeed, the hint was, in the first instance, a distinct order to quit France, and M. de Stael cut a somewhat sorry figure when appearing before the committee to protest against it. In spite of his embarrassed air and want of dignity, he managed to convey to his hearers that to expel the wife of an ambassador would be a violation of rights, and after some discussion the decree was withdrawn. Nevertheless, probably yielding to the prudent representations of her husband, Madame de Stael did retire for a while, and took refuge with a friend. We may suppose that she felt greatly aggrieved and ill-used, and yet it cannot be denied that her qualities, rare and noble though they might be, were not of a nature to recommend her to a revolutionary government. One can even affirm that they were not of a sort to recommend her to any government. Her talents, her wealth, and her position gave her immense social power. When she used this, as she repeatedly did, to inspire officials with disobedience to orders, and to save the lives of reactionary prisoners, at the risk of ruining radical functionaries, it is not to be wondered at if the selfish majority regarded her interference as exceedingly pernicious. It may even be questioned whether her influence at this time was intrinsically valuable. Her state of excited feeling kept her floating between sympathy with principles and sympathy with individuals. The result was an eclecticism of feeling which reflected itself in the composition of her salon. Had she been able to declare herself frankly either monarchical or republican, she might have left some lasting impress on the destinies of her land. As it was, she was kept in a condition of restless activity, which, while sterile of intellectual results, brought her into disrepute as a conspirator. The time was now rapidly approaching when Bonaparte was to cross her path, and, as she chose to conceive it, to spoil her existence. The instrument of destiny in this instance was Benjamin Constant. Immediately after the fall of Robespierre he arrived, a young old man, world-weary, full of unsteady force, and warmed by an inner flame of passion that sometimes smouldered but never died down. A Béarnais noble, he had been reared in aristocratic prejudices, but his life was early embittered by domestic circumstances and the political conditions of his country. After being educated at Oxford, Edinburgh, and in Germany, he was forced by his father to accept the post of chamberlain at the court of Brunswick. Ariel in the cloven pine was not more heartsick, with the difference that Constant's delicate spirit was dashed by a vein of Mephistophelian mockery. Some malignant fairy seemed to have linked to his flashing and unerring insight a disposition the most cynical of which man ever carried the burden through 63 years of life. Being utterly unwarped by illusion, he could place himself on the side of opposition with telling effect, for he could neither deceive himself nor be deceived by others, and if not rigidly conscientious, he was inexorably logical. End of section 9. Section 10 of Madame de Stael by Bella Duffy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. The Transformed Capital, Part 2. At war with the authorities of his native land, too familiarized with order to be further charmed by it, and tired of the solemn absurdities of court functions, he turned his thoughts toward revolutionary Paris as being perhaps the one city in the world which could still afford him a fresh sensation. Moreover, every element of originality and audacity in his brilliant mind was attracted by the amazing spectacle then presented by the Convention. A government which, deprived of organized armies, money, or traditions, confronted with a European coalition and weighted with the responsibility of crime, had conquered its enemies in the field and made its will respected from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, was exactly of a kind to fascinate a born combatant like Constant. He arrived eager to be initiated into that strange world, longing to find himself in the salon of Madame Tallien, Josephine Beauharnais, and Madame de Stael. Hitherto his Egeria had been Madame de Charrière, a charming middle-aged monitress, Dutch by birth but French by right of intellect and choice of language. Her delicate penetration and subtle sympathy with minor moods had doubtless for years responded precisely to his ideal, for if she might not excite, neither could she bore him, and she must have understood his fastidious notions even before he could express them. She was, in fact, perfection, as long as he was still too young to mind feeling old. But there necessarily came a moment when that unconscious comedy was played out. The fitful energy of his nature had gradually vanquished his early lassitude, and he needed to renew his utterances at the founts of some Sibylline inspiration. Madame de Stael appears simply to have overwhelmed him, and the effect which he produced on her was not less startling. Her salon was the rallying ground of contradictory individualities. She believed in those days that she could reconcile irreconcilables, and she welcomed conventionnels like Chénier and Roederer, stranded survivals of a vanished epoch like Suard, Morellet, and La Harpe, and aristocrats, some of them altogether soured and worn out, like Castellane, Choiseul, and Narbonne. Into this political menagerie Constant fell like a spirit from another world. Applauding the Revolution, yet having played no part in it, he was its virgin knight. There was something strange and attractive also in his appearance, a certain awkwardness in figure and gesture, joined to a handsome, clever young face and long fair hair. Just at that moment, 1795, the predominant tendency in Madame de Stael's salon was hostile to the government. She professed herself already to be converted to republicanism, and probably was so in theory, but she had not yet overcome her aversion to the real revolutionaries. Either directly through her influence or with her tacit consent, Constant was induced to publish 3 letters protesting against the admission of 2/3 of the old Convention into the new body of representatives. The success which followed was prodigious. All the women of the Royalist party flattered and caressed him, and all the journalists extolled him to the skies. Constant, however, was not the man to bear that kind of petting long. He required excitement with some keener edge to it, and was, moreover, too logical, too naturally enlightened and liberal to endorse reactionary platitudes. He hastened to disavow the letters, and although he did not find it easy to disabuse the public mind of its first impression, he was careful not to deepen this by any further mistakes. During the following 4 years his intimacy with Madame de Stael flourished and grew apace. They acted and reacted upon one another by the law of their opposing natures. His ardor was as uncertain as hers was steady, but whenever he caught fresh fire, it came from her. On the other hand, the tormenting kind of cruelty which belonged to his cynical caprice seems to have cast a spell upon Madame de Stael's own warm and frank simplicity, which she found it difficult to break. To Constant at this time belongs the merit of having appreciated her thoroughly and defended her warmly, if not invariably, at any rate in his truer moments. On his very first meeting with her, which was in Switzerland, she enthralled him instantaneously, perhaps all the more so that, like most people, he had been prejudiced against her by hearsay. He wrote to Madame de Charrière, who seems to have felt and expressed some bitterness regarding his new acquaintance, that she should get rid of the idea that Madame de Stael was nothing more than a talking machine. He praised her lively interest in every one who suffered, and her courage in scheming for the escape of her friends and enemies. He admitted that she might be active, partly because she could not help it, but silenced further carping by the remark that her activity was well employed. In about a month more his admiration had risen to enthusiasm, and he could hardly find words in which to praise the brilliancy and accuracy of mind, the exquisite goodness, the generosity and social politeness, the simplicity and charm of his latest friend. He declared that she knew just as well how to listen as to talk, a point on which many both before and after Madame de Charrière differed from him, and that she enjoyed the talents of other people quite as much as her own. This was perfectly true. No woman ever breathed who was less envious than Madame de Stael. But, on the other hand, what woman's intellect was ever so unapproachable? At the time, however, of her first acquaintance with Constant, her literary reputation was still to make, and it is not to be wondered at, consequently, if Madame de Charrière felt more inclined to question than agree, when informed that this restless female politician was a being of so superior a sort that her like could not be met with once in a century. About 1796 Madame de Stael took a new departure. Perhaps thanks to Constant's enlightened views, perhaps thanks merely to her own common sense, she felt the full futility of reactionary effort, and ranged herself frankly on the side of the Directory. The Royalist Club de Clichy was by this time an accomplished fact, and to neutralize its mischievous influence the Cercle Constitutionnel had been formed at the Hôtel de Salm. For some time Madame de Stael was the soul of these meetings, and Constant was their orator. Finally, when a fresh division in the Convention declared itself, and a large number of deputies deserted the Directory, Madame de Stael and Constant exerted themselves to prove that such dissensions could profit only the two extremes of Royalists or Terrorists, but never the moderates. Naturally, the latter were deaf. When have moderates eyes to see or ears to hear in moments of vital significance? And Madame de Stael's worst previsions were justified by the events of the 18th Fructidor. The establishment 2 years later of the consulate, while filling Madame de Staël's noble soul with dismay, offered Constant the opportunity assigned to him by his talents. He entered then upon the course of opposition from which he did not again deviate until 16 years later, when he yielded either to Napoleon's personal charm, the fascination of his deeds, and the hope of his repentance, or to the profound disgust of a world-worn man with the imbecility of the Restoration. This is how Constant, in 1800, described the state of the public mind in France. The predominating idea was, liberty has done us harm, and we wish for it no longer, and those who modestly pointed out to these candidates for slavery that the evils of the Revolution came precisely from the fact that the Revolution had suspended liberty, were hounded through the salons under the names of Jacobins and Anarchists. A nation which begged for slavery from a military chieftain of 30, who had covered himself with glory, might count upon its wishes being gratified, and they were. These few lines are a good example of Constant's incisive intellect and biting style. Another man with such gifts would have retired disgusted from all opposition, but Constant loved fighting for its own sake. Perhaps he loved the combat better than the cause, but that is one of the secrets which it is given to no one to fathom. Whatever the central motive, the final fact of his complex and interesting nature, he proved himself the ideal leader of a forlorn hope. By the contemporaries of Constant and Madame de Staël, the connection between these two brilliant minds was, as might be expected, variously judged. Later critics have asserted that he was completely under her influence, but it is more likely that his native cynicism and spurious passion alternately irritated and dominated her. She may have inspired, but she could not mould a nature so original and perverse. Chênedollé said of Madame de Staël about this time that she had more intelligence than she could manage, and in this there was probably some truth. She had hardly begun to write as yet, having published, besides some pamphlets, only the letters on Rousseau and her work on the passions. Her turbulence of ideas, scarcely then reduced to any system, must necessarily have been crystallized at moments by contact with a more definite mind. End of section 10. Section 11 of Madame de Staël by Bella Duffy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8. Madame de Staël meets Napoleon, Part 1. The hostility between Madame de Staël and Napoleon was inevitable, since not a single point of sympathy existed between them. Her moral superiority, unselfishness, romantic ardor, and sincerity were precisely the qualities for which he would feel contempt, as being incompatible with the singleness of individual purpose, serene indifference to suffering, and calm acceptance of means which are necessary to material success. Madame de Staël was intimately convinced that not only honesty but every other virtue constituted the best policy. Napoleon treated all such amiable theories as mere sentimentalism. If occasionally sensual from love of excitement, he was essentially passionless, and looked upon women as toys, not as sentient beings. He hated them to have ideas of their own, he liked them to be elegant, graceful, and pretty. He was brought into contact with Madame de Staël, a woman overflowing with passion, energy, and intellect, large of person, loud of voice, careless in attire. She had generally found her eloquence invincible, and he meant nothing to be invincible but his system. She had every reason to believe in her talent, and proclaimed that belief somewhat obstreperously, while he was disgusted at not being able to differ from her, and at finding that there was still one light which could shine unquenched beside his star. He usually succeeded in repressing people so entirely as to leave alive in them no possibility of protest, but she was by her nature irrepressible. It is true that she records having felt suffocated in his presence, but such a feeling could not have endured in her long. A very little familiarity would have transformed it into impatient rebellion. For Napoleon, society, with a few exceptions, was composed of dummies, some of them a little more tangible and resisting than others, consequently more difficult to thrust out of the way. The individual had no intrinsic value for him, but was simply a factor in the sum of success. Madame de Stael admired everybody who was clever, loved everybody who was good, pitied everybody who was sorrowful. She detested oppression and fought against it and conquered, if not materially, at least morally, although sometimes she hardly foresaw, when engaging in it, how much the fight would cost her. In the beginning of her acquaintance with him, Madame de Stael evidently entertained an admiration for Napoleon greater than that which she eventually cared to avow. Bourrienne goes so far as to assert that she was in love with him, and that she wrote him perfervid letters, which he disdainfully threw into the fire. It is not necessary to accept the whole of this story. Bourrienne, as a returned émigré, can have felt but a meagre sympathy for Madame de Stael, and he probably yielded to the temptation of making his account of her as piquant as possible. But as she never did anything by halves, and always wrote with the most unconventional ardor, it is certain that her first sentiment toward the conqueror of Italy was expressed in a form to weary rather than gratify him. She presumably praised him for views which he did not hold, and for a disinterestedness that he was far from feeling. He must have understood that to an intellect such as hers the first shock of disappointment would bring enlightenment, and then his schemes would be penetrated before they were ripe for execution. Add to these elements of antipathy the fact that every intelligent man in Paris would find his way to Madame de Stael's salon, with the further fact that she herself was not to be silenced, and it becomes easy to imagine how Bonaparte could condescend from his greatness to hate her. His aversion, owing to his Italian blood, had a strain of Pulcinello-like malignity, and every fresh outbreak of clamor from his victim only roused him to strike harder. That he should exile her in the first instance was not only comprehensible but justifiable. He had undertaken a gigantic task, that of accomplishing by the single force of his own will, and in the brief space of his own lifetime, what in the natural course of events would have required the slow action of generations. That is, he sought to weld into his own system the mobile, alert, and impressionable mind of France. To crush a thing so impalpable, to extinguish a thing so fiery, was an impossible undertaking, and to anybody but Napoleon it must have seemed so. He, at least, so far understood its magnitude as to appreciate the full danger of even a momentary reaction. And what in that sombre but electric atmosphere, charged with suppressed fire, was so likely to provoke a reaction as the influence of Madame de Stael, a woman of amazing talent, of high position and great wealth, notoriously disinterested, and although ever true to her principles, yet strongly swayed by personal influences. Moreover, she represented the opposition. Let anybody consider what public opinion is, even in well-ordered England, how it reverses in a moment the best laid plans of ministers, and it becomes easy to understand how in revolutionary France a new thought emanating from Madame de Stael's salon could prove gravely dangerous to Napoleon. In exiling her, he only treated her as she had been treated already. If he found her in France on coming to power, it was because she had been reconciled to the Directory, but there never was the least chance of her becoming reconciled to him. There are several very womanly touches in Madame de Staël's own account of her relations with Napoleon. Here is one of them, relating apparently to a time when the aversion between the First Consul and his illustrious foe had become an accomplished but not an acknowledged fact. Madame de Staël was invited to General Berthier's one evening when it was known that Napoleon would be present. "As I knew," she says, "that he spoke very ill of me, it struck me that he would address me with some of the rude things which he often liked to say to women, even to those who flattered him, and I wrote down on chance, before going to the party, the different stinging and spirited replies which I could make to his speeches. I did not wish to be taken by surprise if he insulted me, for that would have been a greater want of character even than of wit, and as nobody could be sure of remaining at ease with such a man, I had prepared myself beforehand to defy him. Fortunately, it was unnecessary. He only put the most insignificant question in the world to me, for he never attacks except where he feels himself to be the stronger." The whole of this passage is enchantingly simple-minded. One may be allowed to think, in spite of Madame de Staël's assertion to the contrary, that she was really disappointed in not being able to make some of her defiant retorts to the conqueror, but it was childlike of her to have arranged them in advance. Napoleon was preparing to invade Switzerland. Madame de Staël flattered herself for a moment that she might deter him from the project, and sought an interview with him for that purpose. The tête-à-tête lasted an hour, and Napoleon listened with the utmost patience, but he did not give himself any trouble to discuss Madame de Staël's arguments, and quickly diverted the conversation to his own love of solitude, country life, and fine arts, 3 things for which, by the way, his visitor cared almost as little as himself. She came away convinced that the eloquence of Cicero and Demosthenes combined would not move him, but captivated, she admits, by the charm of his manner, in other words, by the false bonhomie which he possessed the art of introducing into his Italian garrulity. While Madame de Staël pleaded and Bonaparte chattered, they were both learning to understand one another, but it is most probable that the first to be enlightened was the man. Switzerland being threatened with an invasion, Madame de Staël left Paris in 1798 to join her father at Coppet, for he was still on the list of émigrés, and therefore came under a law which forbade him on pain of death to remain on any soil occupied by French troops. His daughter, always as much alarmed by remote danger as courageous when in imminent peril, trembled for his safety and supplicated him to leave, but in vain. He probably supposed that her fears were groundless, and so they turned out to be. When Madame de Staël was returning to France, Necker, anxious to have his name erased from the list of the proscribed, drew up a memorial to that effect, which was presented by his daughter to the government. His request having been unanimously granted, his next step was to endeavour to recover the 2 millions which he had quixotically left in the public treasury when quitting France on the outbreak of the Revolution. The government recognized the debt and offered to pay it out of the confiscated church lands. But to this M. Necker would not consent. He no longer disapproved of the sale of ecclesiastical property, but he did not wish to throw doubt on his perfect impartiality by confounding his interests with his opinions. End of section 11. Section 12 of Madame de Staël by Bella Duffy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8. Madame de Stael meets Napoleon, Part 2. About this time Madame de Stael's separation from her husband took place. Her ostensible object was to ensure the safety of her children's fortune, which was jeopardized by Baron de Stael's extravagance. Any other reason which may have existed is not of great importance, inasmuch as the Baron, always a shadowy personage, had finally been quite eclipsed by his brilliant wife. He was said to be indifferent to her, but he seems to have been always fairly amiable and very obedient. As it will not be necessary to speak of him again, it may be mentioned here that he died in 1802, and that his last moments were soothed by the ministrations of his wife, who, hearing that he was ill, travelled from Switzerland to France to attend on him, and tried to bring him back with her to Coppet, but he expired on the road at a place called Poligny. Madame de Stael happened to be returning from Coppet to Paris on the 18th Brumaire, when she learnt that her carriage had passed that of her former ally, Barras, who was returning to his estate at Grosbois, accompanied by gendarmes. The name of Bonaparte was on everybody's lips. The first time, as she remarks, that such a thing had happened since the Revolution. The state of things which she found on entering the capital was of a kind to excite her imagination. 5 weeks of intrigue had ripened Napoleon's opportunity, and the 19th Brumaire dawned on a France exhausted and enslaved. From that moment Madame de Stael's role was marked out for her irrevocably as one of perpetual opposition. At no time inclined to silence, she was, we may be sure, both loud and intrepid in her denunciation of the new tyranny. At first Napoleon appeared disposed to win her over. Joseph Bonaparte, who was her friend and frequented her salon, came to her once with something that sounded like a message. Napoleon had asked why Madame de Stael would not give in her adhesion to his government. Did she want the 2 millions to be paid to her father, or residence in Paris accorded him? There should be no difficulty about either. She had only to say what it was she wanted. Madame de Stael's answer is celebrated. The question is not what I want, but what I think. Some protests against the growing despotism proceeded from the Tribunat, and notably from Constant. It is superfluous to say that Madame de Stael applauded these with fervour. It is well known how the evening previous to a celebrated speech which she was about to make, Constant consulted her on the subject. She encouraged him warmly, although already perceiving that the path which she had elected to tread would in all likelihood lead to exile. The salon was full of her friends at the time, but Constant warned her that, if he spoke the next day, everybody would desert her. "You must obey your conscience," she replied, but adds that had she known what she would have to suffer from that day and throughout the next 10 years, her answer might have been different. But here we think that Madame de Stael's literary instinct carried her away. She was very sincere, but very imaginative, and when writing for the public, it must often have been difficult for her to distinguish between what she felt before and after the fact. Considering what her disposition was, and the opportunities for eloquence afforded both to herself and Constant by an attitude of hostility to Napoleon, it is impossible to resist the conclusion that she enjoyed her opposition with one half of her nature, if she regretted its results with the other. For some weeks after Constant's speech, Madame de Stael's salon, usually so animated, was silent and deserted. Joseph Bonaparte was forbidden by his brother to attend it, but most people needed no prohibition. They absented themselves of their own accord under various pretexts. Fouché, the Minister of Police, called on her and insinuated that a brief retirement into the country would be advisable, as giving the storm time to blow over. She took the hint and retired for a short time to Saint-Ouen. On her return to Paris, she avers that she did not find Napoleon's wrath at all appeased. Apparently she expected it to die a spontaneous death, for she did not adopt the only means by which she could have pacified him, but continued to applaud, if not instigate, an active hostility to his measures. It would have been grand and magnanimous of Napoleon to have despised the enmity of a woman, but he was neither grand nor magnanimous. Moreover, the last thing which Madame de Stael probably desired was to be despised. Nobody can deny her the meed of admiration which she deserved for her love of liberty, and the indomitable spirit with which, when in exile, she refused to conciliate her oppressor by one word of praise. But inasmuch as she knew with whom she had to deal, and what would be the consequence of her actions, one must admit that the amount of pity which she claimed for herself, and has generally received, is excessive. She was in direct contradiction to her own theories of a woman's true duty when interfering in politics, and in being treated by Napoleon as a man might have been, she paid the penalty of the splendid intellect which emancipated her from the habits and the views, if not from the weaknesses, of her sex. She was neither helpless nor harmless, since she could stir up enemies to the tyrant by her eloquence and revenge herself when punished by the power of her pen. She was exiled not because she was a woman and defenceless, but because she was a genius and formidable. She deliberately engaged in a contest of which the object was to prove who was the stronger, herself or Napoleon. She came out of it scarred but dauntless. What right had she to complain because the weapons that wounded her were keen? Besides, paltry as Napoleon showed himself in many respects, he was a phenomenon of so exceptional a nature that to judge him by ordinary standards was absurd. It was the weakness of France which made his opportunity, and if the epoch had not been abnormal, he never could have dominated it. The people whom he governed had two courses open to them: to submit or to protest. The first brought profit, the second glory, and the glory which is purchased by no sacrifice is unworthy of the name. In 1801, Madame de Stael published her work on literature, in which, as she said, there was not a word concerning Napoleon, although the most liberal sentiments were expressed in it with force. The book produced an immense sensation, and Parisian society, in its admiration for the writer, forgot the First Consul's displeasure, and again crowded around her. She admits that the winter of 1801 was a pleasant one. Napoleon, passing through Switzerland the previous summer, had seen and spoken with M. Necker. It is characteristic of both interlocutors that the ex-statesman was far more impressed with the warrior than the latter with him. Necker divined in the young hero a strength of will to which his own hesitating nature was a stranger, while Napoleon, on his side, penetrating but prejudiced, contemptuously described the once august financier in two words: a banker and an idealist. With his usual cynicism, he attributed Necker's visit to the desire of employment, whereas Madame de Stael affirmed that her father's chief object was to plead her cause. In this he was so far successful that residence in France was, for some time at least, assured to her. "It was," she writes, "the last time that my father's protecting hand was extended over my life." For the moment, either this beneficent influence, or, as is more likely, a passing fit of good humour on the part of Napoleon, enabled her to enjoy existence. Fouché consented to recall several émigrés for whom she interceded, and even Joseph Bonaparte once again treated her with cordiality and entertained her for a little time at his estate at Morfontaine. A variety of circumstances arose to put an end to this state of affairs and to revive Napoleon's dislike to Madame de Stael. Her father published his work, Dernière Vue de Politique et de Finance, with the avowed intention of protesting against Napoleon's growing tyranny. His daughter had encouraged him in this feeling, herself unable, as she declares, to silence this song of the swan. Then Bernadotte had inaugurated a certain sullen opposition to the First Council, and Madame de Stael immediately became his friend. Finally, her salon was more crowded than ever, and by great personages such as the Prince of Orange and other embryo potentates, besides foreigners of celebrity in letters and science. Napoleon detested salons. It was his conviction that a woman who disposed of social influence might do anything in France, inasmuch as he held that the best brains in the country were female. Madame de Stael, moreover, possessed the art of keeping herself well before the public. Even now she had just published Delphine, and all the papers were full of it. To please Napoleon, they condemned it as immoral, a strange criticism in that age, and an excellent advertisement in any. Napoleon, on Madame de Stael's again visiting Switzerland, hinted to Lebrun that she would do well not to return to Paris. His obsequious colleague hastened to intimate this by letter, and although the communication was not official, the First Council's lightest intimations by this time carried so much weight that Madame de Stael was compelled to obey. She did so very reluctantly, and perhaps if her father's prudence had not been greater than her own, her longing to be back in the capital would have overpowered every other consideration. As it was, she made the best she could of a year's uninterrupted sojourn at Coppet. The Tribunat, meanwhile, had shown itself again rebellious. Bonaparte, irritated, declared that he would shake 12 or 15 of its members from his clothes like vermin, and Constant had no choice but to rejoin his friend in Switzerland. End of Section 12. Section 13 of Madame de Stael by Bella Duffy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9. New Faces at Coppet, Part 1. Some remarkable people had already begun to cluster around the Chatelaine of Coppet. De Gerando, Sismondi, Camille Jordan, Madame de Crudinet, Madame Récamier, all are interesting names. Camille Jordan, who was introduced by de Gerando, appears to have been taken up at once with characteristic ardor by Madame de Stael. His Vrai sens du vote national sous le consulat à vie, published in 1802, was just the kind of trumpet call to which she always responded. Straightway her letters to him become frequent and full of the excessive fervour and flattery which distinguished all her protestations of affection. Oddly enough, Madame de Crudinet, not yet a priestess but a most decided coquette, appears to have exercised a rather perturbing influence upon these new relations. Madame de Stael writes that she would have liked to send Jordan a ring containing a lock of her hair, and formerly the property of her husband, but she is restrained by the recollection of Madame de Crudinet's fair tresses, for which she learns Camille entertains a lively admiration. Another letter contains an invitation to him to join her and one or two other friends in a journey to Italy, coupled with a playful hint that in such scenes he might find her society more agreeable than the lovely blondes. Camille not responding in the way desired, Madame de Stael betrays some wounded feeling. She had thought that when once she had admired Jordan's writing so much. Everything must be in harmony between them. She had been mistaken. She would take refuge in silence. Nevertheless, she was not silent, and Madame de Krudenay's name reappears. Madame de Stael was willing to admit that she is a remarkable person, but objects that she is always talking of persons who have killed themselves for love of her. Then Jourdan is summoned to say if it be true that he is in love, not with Madame, but with Mademoiselle de Krudener. She has nothing but a Greuze-like face to recommend her, and if she has enthralled him, then why has he not fallen a victim to every girl of 15? Nevertheless, if he really be in love, and will confess it, Madame de Stael will set herself to study Mademoiselle de Krudener better, with a view to loving her herself, if she prove indeed worthy of Jourdan's affection. In reading all this, one is forced to the conclusion that a more emotional woman than Madame de Stael never trod the earth. Every human creature, perhaps, has one unsolved, it may be insoluble, riddle in his life, one mystery of feeling which nobody fathoms. More especially is this true of women, who live so much in sentiment, and supremely true of a woman like Madame de Stael. That ineffable something in her which nobody seems to have guessed while she was living, of which Byron felt the presence in her without divining the cause, was the passionate and unappeasable desire to be loved. All men who had dealings with her appear to have misunderstood her in so far that they believed her to be more dominated by her head than her heart, instead of understanding that in her head and heart were the systole and diastole of a temperament surprisingly forcible, but not essentially strong. Or if they did learn to comprehend her better at last, it was when she was no longer young, and feeling of a certain sort had become, alas, ridiculous. As long as she was entitled to feel and to suffer, they made almost a reproach to her of the intellectual superiority which they could not deny, and cast her back upon her own thoughts for happiness. Madame de Krudener, on one occasion, arrived at the complacent conclusion that Madame de Stael was jealous of her. Not jealous of her beauty and golden locks, which was conceivable and might have been true, but jealous of her literary fame. Corinne jealous of Valérie. It is true that Corinne had not yet seen the light, while Valérie had not only appeared, but had met with great success. So great an authority as Sainte-Beuve pronounces Madame de Krudener's novel to be a thing of joy, a work to be read thrice, in youth, in middle life, and in old age. But it is possible to have many intellectual qualities and yet remain at such an immeasurable distance beneath Madame de Stael that nothing but vanity could scale the height. Moreover, Madame de Krudener's meaner self had not been a stranger to the immediate and surprising triumph of her work. She was always intriguing, and intrigued to some purpose when her novel was on the eve of publication. She ran about to all the fournisseurs in Paris, asking them for bows à la Valérie, caps and gowns à la Valérie. They heard the name for the first time, but naturally proceeded to call a variety of articles by an appellation presumably so fashionable, and the success of the novel was assured. Madame de Krudener, promptly and conveniently oblivious of the sources of this sudden triumph, allowed herself to become somewhat intoxicated by it, and wrote to a friend that the dear woman, meaning Madame de Stael, was jealous of her. The person at whom this accusation was levelled probably never heard of it. She certainly would never have divined it, and the little difficulty about Jourdan once overcome, she appears to have found Madame de Krudener's society more than tolerable. Indeed, they ended by becoming affectionate friends, but that was after the authoress of Valérie had undergone the mystic change which transformed her from a flirt into a priestess. She has always been immensely admired, and had not preserved a spotless reputation, but she had one of those emotional natures in which a restless vanity, love of novelty, a morbid sensibility, and an excess of imagination combine to produce religious fervours. Standing at a window in Riga one day, she saw an admirer drop dead at the very moment that he was lifting his hat to salute her. This event made on her one of those terrifying and ineffaceable impressions which in regenerate circles is known as a call. She plunged into mysticism, became the exponent of a new dogma, and finally claimed for herself the gift of prophecy. People were, of course, not wanting to declare that her predictions had in several instances been verified, and her personal fascination remaining always great, she now acquired an enormous influence. Her extreme self-abnegation and boundless charities increased her reputation for sanctity, and she even succeeded in bringing down on herself a satisfactory amount of persecution. In Paris, superstition was, as always, rife. The days were not yet so remote when Philip Égalité had gone to question the devil in the quarries of Montrouge, and men were barely more than middle-aged who, in their first youth, had looked on the brazen brow of Cagliostro and felt their blood agreeably frozen by the Comte de Saint-Germain's casual mention of personal experiences 300 years old. But little more than 30 years previous to Madame de Krudenay's revival, Mesmer had seen numbers of the fairest and many not of the stupidest heads in Paris gathered round his famous baquet. A little later the Illuminati had been credited unveraciously and to their scant honor with a share in the sanguinary priesthood of Robespierre, and finally Mademoiselle Lenormand had shuffled the cards of prophecy at the instance of Napoleon himself. Into this strange world, so exhausted and cynical, yet excited, impulsive, and thirsting for novel emotions, the northern Sibyl, with her strange pale face and shining eyes, came like a wandering star. But all this was subsequent to our first meeting with her at Capet, when she was still fairly young and singularly pretty, and the gold in her tresses owed as yet no fancied splendor to the aureole of inspiration. Madame Récamier, the charming Juliette, was a far more normal, but a not less attractive personality. Chateaubriand's memoirs have made her famous, but he was among the latest of her many swains. Her path through life was strewn with conquests, and she had offers of marriage by the score. They continued up to the age of 51, when the author of René laid a heart which was hardly worthy of her at her feet. 3 generations of Montmorencys adored her. A German prince of royal blood urged her to divorce her husband in order to marry him, and Lucien Bonaparte was among the most ardent of her slaves. Ampère the younger, at 20, fell in love with her, she being then 43, and Chateaubriand addressed her as très belle et très charmante when she was 70 and blind. The little Savoyards turned round in the streets to look at her, and when they did so no longer, she knew that her marvellous beauty was on the wane. But the fascination of her grace, her goodness, her unfailing tact and delicate intelligence survived her loveliness, and the men who knew her still worshipped her for years after fresher charms had attracted the eyes of the multitude. She was not a politician, but her friendship with Madame de Stael gave her decided opinions, and she incurred the anger of Napoleon by declining to be Dame du Palais to one of his sisters. It was said, however, that what especially raised his ire was that a throng, which on one occasion had been assembled to do homage to him, so far forgot his presence when Madame Récamier appeared as to have eyes only for her. Finally, Constant, the inexplicable, unhappy, brilliant Constant, sought the peace which he had never found in anyone, in a tardy passion for her. He sought in vain, for she treated him as she treated all men, with a kind and gracious indifference which her unique fascination robbed of all its sting. She influenced his political conduct, not altogether for good as it turned out in 1814, when Napoleon returned from Elba. Vague hints at a rivalry before this date between her and Madame de Stael are to be found in some of the correspondence of the time, but they are contradicted by the tone of Madame de Stael's letters to her belle Juliette, and by Madame Récamier's own rare discretion. Moreover, although Constant first saw Madame Récamier at Coppet in 1806, and confided to her those grievances of his against Madame de Stael, which just then were rising to exasperation point, it was only in 1813, when she called upon him to defend the interests of Murat at the Congress of Vienna, that he fell in love with her. The correspondence which ensued between them does more honor to her than to him. Leaving aside the questionable nature of his passion, he allowed himself to speak of Madame de Stael with a fractious mistrust, which, even if transitory, could have come from nobody with a more deplorable grace. The basis of the sentiment appears to have been jealousy of Madame de Stael's influence over her devoted friend. Such a jealousy was as futile as paltry, for it would have needed a more witching tongue even than Constance to have shaken the loyalty of the loving Juliette. To gratify a request of hers, he wrote some fragments of memoir, and sketched a portrait of Madame de Stael, which, besides much praise, contains some furtive sarcasm at her inexpugnable belief in herself, that large quality, too grand to be called conceit, which, according to Constant, amounted to a cultus and inspired a religious respect. End of Section 13. Section 14 of Madame de Stael by Bella Duffy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9. New Faces at Coppet, Part 2. It is interesting to record that the first time Chateaubriand ever saw Madame Récamier was at Madame de Stael's. He had gone to thank the latter for having occupied herself about his recall to France. He found her at her toilette, talking eagerly and twirling in her fingers, as usual, a little green twig. Madame Récamier suddenly entered, dressed in white. From that moment Chateaubriand was so absorbed in her that he had no longer any attention to bestow on her eloquent friend. This was in 1800. He did not see her again for 12 years. Benjamin Constant, in the portrait already mentioned, has left an account of Madame Récamier and Madame de Stael, which gives a very good idea of both of them, and is specially interesting as coming from such a source. He relates that at the first interview between them, Madame Récamier felt very shy. He says, "Madame de Stael's appearance has been much discussed, but a magnificent glance, a sweet smile, and a habitual expression of kindness, the absence of all minute affectation and of all embarrassing reserve, flattering words, praise a little direct but apparently dictated by enthusiasm, an inexhaustible variety in conversation, astonish, attract, and reconcile almost everybody who approaches her. I know no woman, and even no man, who is more convinced of her immense superiority over the whole world, and who renders this conviction less oppressive to others. Nothing could be more charming than the conversations between Madame de Stael and Madame Récamier. The rapidity of the one in expressing 1,000 new thoughts, the rapidity of the second in seizing and judging them, on the one side a strong and masculine intelligence which unmasked everything, on the other a delicate and penetrating mind which understood everything. All this formed a whole impossible to render for those who did not enjoy the privilege of witnessing it. Madame de Staël scattered golden rain of the frankest and sincerest praise over Madame Récamier every time that she addressed her. "You are exquisite, you are beautiful, you reign as a queen over sentiment," are among the sentences that stud every other line of her letters. Another of her female friends was she whom she named the sweet Annette de Gérandeau, the wife of the author of The Signs and Art of Thinking in their Mutual Relations, The Origin of Human Intelligence, The Comparative History of Philosophic Systems, etc. He was a philanthropist as well as a philosopher, and Madame de Staël in later years once made rather a bitter allusion to this fact. As time went on and Napoleon's star blazed brighter, de Gérandeau was unable to resist the general infection of idolatry. Moreover, he had accepted a post under the new government, and the withering blight of officialism fell to a certain extent on his spirit. "There is too much philanthropy in his friendship," wrote Madame de Staël to Jourdain. "One is afraid of being treated by him like a pauper." But in the summer of 1801 all this was still in the future, and harmony and wit reigned at Coppet. Sismondi about this time appears on the scene, discreet, observant, serene, reasonable. He conceived for Madame de Staël a friendship which remained moderate in expression and sincere in feeling to the last. He was not as much dazzled by her as many, and saw her failings clearly. Occasionally she even wounded his quiet self-love, and once or twice, when very restless and excited, she offended him. But he was invariably drawn back to her by the spell of her goodness. He appears as a rock of strength amid all the sparkling, moving, changing tide of ideas and feelings that rippled, dashed, recoiled, and returned unceasingly in every hour of the sojourn at Coppet. His steady sense and calm judgment bring into sharper contrast the unrest of Constant, the flashing splendor of Madame de Staël, the dreamy refinement of Mathieu de Montmorency, the fantastic charm of Madame de Kriüdener, and the unfailing grace of the lovely Juliette. Bonstetten was yet another visitor at the chateau. He was called the Swiss Voltaire, was eternally young, and even grew younger and more plastic in mind as the unnoticed years crept over him. He had seen Madame Necker in Paris when she was still unmarried, and reappeared in her daughter's home at Coppet as gay, as smiling, as vivacious and witty as he had shown himself in the long-vanished salon of Madame de Verminoux. He laid himself at Madame de Staël's feet at once, was received by her with her usual gracious warmth, and profited by her keen but generous criticism of his works. Everybody began by gently laughing at Bonstetten's incurable youthfulness, and ended by adoring him for it. He wanted steadiness of intellectual purpose, a belfry, as Sainte-Beuve expresses it; in other words, some central fact of mind round which all his ideas could rally. But he had plenty of insight, and amid the universal eulogium of Madame de Staël's powers seems to have been the first to point out a defect in her which Schiller commented on later. For when writing of her to Frederica Brune, he says, "Her goodness is extreme, and nobody has more intellect, but that which is best in you, in her does not exist. She lacks feeling for art, and sees no beauty except in eloquence and intelligence. She has more practical wisdom than anybody, but uses it more for her friends than herself." Frederica Brune herself came to Geneva about this time, and has left enthusiastic descriptions of Madame de Staël, of Necker, Madame Necker de Saussure, and Madame Rillier Hubert. She also bore testimony to Madame de Staël's devotion to her children. Her eldest son, Auguste, and her only daughter, Albertine, were destined all her life to solace her by their love for much that she suffered. She directed the education of both her boys, but occupied herself especially with that of the girl. She was accused by some of her friends, even by Sismondi, of not caring very much for her children, but no word of theirs ever betrayed any sense of such a deficiency in her. On the contrary, both Auguste and Albertine always spoke and wrote of her with the utmost enthusiasm. After spending 2 summers and 1 winter uninterruptedly at Coppet, during which period she wrote and published Delphine, the desire to return to France grew into an overpowering force. Napoleon had now been declared consul for life, and was preparing to invade England. She hoped, she said, that amid such multifarious occupations he would not have leisure to conceive any objection against her establishing herself within a few miles of Paris, near enough, in fact, to enjoy the society of such friends as would not be too much in awe of the potentate to pay her occasional visits. She further deluded herself with the notion that Napoleon would shrink from the odium of exiling a woman so well known as herself. Such a hope shows how simple Madame de Stael could still be at times. Napoleon was no longer in a position in which blame for mere details of conduct could touch him, and his career from this moment was to be one long outrage on public opinion. Madame de Stael established herself in a country house about 10 miles from Paris. Then there happened a circumstance which she had not foreseen. In the 18 months of her sojourn at Coppet, the society which she knew formerly had grown baser. A whole race of parasites had arisen, whose real or fancied interest it was to obtain the favor of Napoleon by denouncing the people whom he detested. A woman whose name is suppressed lost no time in informing Napoleon that the road leading to Madame de Stael's dwelling was crowded with her visitors. Immediately one of her friends warned her that a gendarme would probably be sent to her without loss of time. She instantly became a prey to anxiety. An excessive anxiety, it is certain, for she was excessive in most things. She wrote to De Gerando to plead her cause with Talleyrand. She solicited the good offices of Lucien and Joseph Bonaparte, and finally she wrote a passionate but dignified letter to Napoleon himself. Then she waited, in the midst of strangers, and consuming herself with a fiery impatience that made every hour of fresh suspense a torture. She spent the nights sitting up with her maid, listening for the tramp of the horse which was to bring the gendarme and his message. But the gendarme did not arrive, and, worn out with her terrors, Madame de Stael bethought herself of her beautiful Juliette. That loving and devoted person assured her of a kind welcome at Saint-Brice, a place about 2 leagues from Paris. Thither Madame de Stael went, and finding there a varied and agreeable society, was for the time being cured of her fears. Hearing nothing more about her exile, she persuaded herself that Napoleon had changed his mind, and she returned with some friends to her lodgings at Maffliers. It was probable enough that some officious courtier again drew her enemy's attention to her, or perhaps Madame de Stael's own letter, in which she spoke of her children's education and her father's advanced age, and betrayed in every line her haunting fear of exile, enlightened Napoleon as to the tenderest spot in which to wound her. Disliking her as he did, and irritated by the mere thought of her, as he seems to have been, it would have been highly characteristic of his southern malice to be decided in his course by the very prayers that should have deterred him. However that may be, she was sitting at table with her friends one late September afternoon, when she perceived a rider dressed in grey pull up at her gate and ring the bell. The prosaic-looking individual was the messenger of destiny. She felt it at once, although he did not wear the dreaded uniform. He was the bearer of a letter signed by Napoleon, and ordering her to depart within 24 hours for any place not nearer than 40 leagues to Paris. Needless to say, Madame de Stael did not submit without protest, and represented so energetically to the gendarme that a woman and 3 children could not be hurried off with no more preparation than a recruit's, as to induce him to allow her 3 days at Paris in which to get ready. On their way they stopped for a few moments at Madame Récamier's, and there found General Junot, who, like everybody else, was one of Juliet's admirers. Perhaps to please the latter, he promised to intercede with the despot for her illustrious friend, and he was, as it appears, so far successful that Napoleon accorded permission for Madame de Staël to reside at Dijon. As soon as Madame Récamier received this news, she communicated it in a letter to the care of Camille Jordan. But Madame de Staël never received it, having been driven, as she says, by daily admonitions from her gendarme, but, as Madame Récamier appeared to think, by her own impatient agitation, away from Paris to Morfontaine. This was the home of Joseph Bonaparte. Probably pitying her state of excitement and misery, he invited her thither to spend a few days. He was just then animated, as far as he dared be, by a spirit of opposition to his mighty brother, and perhaps, who knows, was kind to Madame de Staël as much for that reason as for any other. In any case, nobody in those days appears to have been profoundly in earnest, excepting Madame de Staël herself. She could not recover either patience or peace. She was wretched at Morfontaine, in spite of the kindness of her host and hostess, because surrounded with officers of the government who had accepted the servitude against which she rebelled. She knew that her father would receive her, but the thought of taking refuge at Coppet again was distasteful to her. She had but just left that place, and to return thither was to resume habits of which she had tired, and to acknowledge herself beaten. Probably she longed for a change, and probably enough also she was in that morbid condition of mind in which to do the simplest and most obvious thing is to rob grief of all its luxury. Finally, she decided to crave permission through Joseph to betake herself to Germany, with the distinct assurance that the French minister there would consider her a foreigner and leave her in peace. Joseph hastened to St. Cloud for the purpose, and Madame de Staël retired to an inn within 2 leagues of Paris, there to await his reply. At the end of one day, receiving no answer and fearing, but why, to attract attention to herself by remaining any longer in one inn, she sought the shelter of another, and is extremely, one cannot really help thinking, needlessly eloquent in describing her anguish during these self-imposed peregrinations. At last Joseph's letter came. He not only forwarded her the permission to go to Berlin, but added several valuable letters of introduction, and took leave of her in the kindest terms. Accompanied by her children and Benjamin Constant, she started, hating the postilions for their boasted speed, and feeling that every step taken by the horses was a fresh link in the ever-lengthening and indestructible chain of which one end was Paris and the other her heart. What Constant's feelings were she does not say, and speaks of his accompanying her as a spontaneous act of friendship. But he had been exiled as well as herself, and although his desire to go to Germany had partly determined hers, and neither wished to separate from the other, there are indications that Constant quitted France as reluctantly as his companion. Their relations were already varied by alternate periods of shine and storm, and although her influence over him was still immense, it had begun, as was inevitable with such a man, to fret him. And probably some doubts that were not political, and some sufferings that had their root in another cause than exile, played their part in the extreme agitation of Madame de Staël's mind at this period. End of Section 14. Section 15 of Madame de Staël by Bella Duffy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10. Madame de Staël visits Germany. At Metz, Madame de Staël was received in triumph. The prefect of the Moselle entertained her, parties were given in her honor, and all the literary bigwigs of the place hastened to do her homage. She there, for the first time, came into personal contact with Charles de Villers, with whom she had previously corresponded on the subject of Kant. Of course she was charmed with him, her first impulse invariably being to find every clever or distinguished person delightful. Her friendship with him resembled all her friendships. She began by expecting to have inspired as much enthusiasm as she felt, possibly a little more, seeing that she was a woman, and such a woman, an exile to boot. Villers, a cross-grained kind of Teuton, had no idea of allowing his theories, which were extremely sturdy on all subjects, to be spirited away by any of Madame de Staël's conversational conjuring tricks. They discussed philosophy, and he railed sourly at French taste, perhaps by way of proving his final emancipation from all such fetters. He had obtained the companionship of a certain Madame de Rodde, whom Madame de Staël described with some asperity as a fat German. But she separated from the philosopher, still quite charmed with his appreciation of the good and true, and not in the least repulsed by his ways. On the contrary, she wrote to him shortly afterwards, reproaching him passionately with his silence. One can imagine how absurd such exactions must have seemed to the good Villers, with his head full of Kant and Madame de Rodde to attend to his comforts. But the truth was that Madame de Staël's mood just then caused her to make herself needlessly miserable about everything. To Mathieu de Montmorency she wrote that she was filled with terror, and fancied that death must shortly overtake her father, children, friends, everybody dear to her. She seemed to forget entirely that it was her own choice which had taken her to Germany. Napoleon had banished her merely from Paris. There was nothing to prevent her returning to Coppet to soothe the last years and to enjoy the conversation of her venerated father. But this did not suit her. She required a wider intellectual horizon and more varied society. For many reasons, some of them dependent on the political bias of monarchical writers, it has been the fashion to proclaim Madame de Staël's opposition to Napoleon as inspired by a pure hatred of despotism. To us this does not seem quite a correct version. If it were, Madame de Staël would have been a totally different person, colder, less impulsively benevolent, less thoroughly womanly. All through her life her conduct was determined by her feeling toward individuals. While professing republicanism, she counted, as we have seen, hosts of reactionary friends. The claims to consideration of noble names and social distinctions weighed powerfully with her, and all her love of liberty could not save her from being torn by sympathy for every royalist head that fell during the Revolution. Such a catholicity of feeling constitutes a charming woman, but not a great politician, and Madame de Staël's liberal instincts and penetrating insight only lent force to her hatred of Napoleon. They did not originate it. There was a natural antagonism between their natures. Circumstances increased this, and obstinacy on both sides confirmed it. And Madame de Staël made the most of a persecution which, while condemning her to inaction, added enormously to her fame. That Napoleon, in his most transcendent moments, was great simply by stupendous intellect and amazing will, that in his baser moments he was inconceivably callous, cynical, arrogant, and mean, perhaps few persons in these days will be found to deny. But it is overstating the case to assert, as has been done, that he persecuted Madame de Staël from unmitigated envy of her superiority. Much as he resented intellectual power in a woman, it is nevertheless most likely that what really inspired his actions against Madame de Staël was her turbulent disposition and the restless mind which made her the centre of Parisian opposition. As to this opposition itself, without any wish to detract from its sublimity, it may fairly be asked whether, at the time Constant began his denunciations and Madame de Staël encouraged them, it was altogether well timed. To declaim against Napoleon's growing despotism was perhaps irresistible to independent spirits, but such declamation necessarily remained sterile of results in the state in which France then was. What would these orators have substituted for the strong will of a dictator? The greed for place of a Talleyrand? The mystic fervour of a Montmorency? The dissolute ambition of a Barras? Between the sanguinary excesses of the Terreur Rouge, the lust for revenge of the Terreur Blanche, the incorrigible short-sightedness and criminal frivolity of the Coblentz faction, the diseased logic of the Jacobins, and the frightful collapse of intelligence, morality, decency, and humanity that extended from end to end of France, it is difficult to understand what ruler could have governed it for other ends than personal ones. Napoleon sprang armed from the ruin of France as a kind of fatal embodiment of all the evil under which she groaned and all the crime that stained her. And yet who shall say that his career of conquest, desolating as it was, could have been spared from European history? It enters as a factor into almost all that this closing century has brought us: the unity of Italy, the power of Germany, France's own awakening to the limitations of her destiny. It was not given to any mortal 80 years ago to foresee all this, and Madame de Staël, who was in most things of a preternatural acuteness, only foresaw the coming despotism and its immediate, not its ultimate results. Nevertheless, had her bias against Napoleon not been a personal one, she might have submitted more quietly to his first acts of tyranny, and only protested when his insatiable ambition had prostrated France at the feet of the nations. She might have done this because she was constantly led away by her feelings and could be blinded on occasion. That she was not more dazzled by Napoleon must be considered a lucky accident. In Germany the feeling in regard to her was not generally favourable. The mightiest minds indeed admired her great intellect, and Goethe's unwilling homage is the brightest jewel in her crown. But it was as a woman that she excited a somewhat sour antipathy. Her plaintive little friend, Madame de Beaumont, had called her a tourbillon, and Heine has only added a doubtful picturesqueness to this description when designating her a whirlwind in petticoats. But as a most disturbing element she certainly did introduce herself into German society. Rahel Varnhagen acidly, it is difficult to help thinking ungenerously, echoes the usual complaint of her obstreperousness, saying with striking lack of originality, by the way, "She is nothing to me but an inconvenient hurricane." Schiller, as is well known, was infinitely more magnanimous. He had made up his mind as to her kind of intellect before she came. In 1798 he had already pronounced her to be of an exalted, reasoning, entirely unpoetical nature, and although he clung after seeing her to his conviction that of poetry she had no conception, he was obviously surprised and enchanted at her native goodness, her healthy simplicity of mind and unaffectedness. To her penetration, brilliancy, and vivacity he does full justice. And if, as her book on Germany afterwards showed, his statement that nothing existed for her unless her torch could illuminate it was as misleading as are most metaphors, still its descriptiveness enables one exactly to understand the particular sort of splendor with which Madame de Staël flashed through the windings of the German mind. Schiller, poor man, was quite pathetic over her amazing volubility, which left him, with his halting French, a hopeless distance behind her. It is rather comic to trace the dismay at her exhausting personality which pierces through all his admiration for and interest in her mind. To Goethe, who was coquetting at Jena, and wished the brilliant stranger to come there to him, Schiller later writes, "I saw the de Stael yesterday in my house, and again to-day at the Dowager Duchess's. One would be reminded of the sieve of the Danaides, if Oknos with his donkey did not then occur to one." He fears she will have to discover that the Germans in Weimar can be fickle as well as the French, unless it strikes her soon that it is time she went. To Körner he complained that the devil had brought the French female philosopher to torment him just in the middle of his new play. He found her, of all mortals within his experience, the most gesticulative, combative, and talkative, even while admitting that she was almost the most cultivated and intellectual of women. But he declared that she destroyed all poetry in him, and waxed plaintive once again over his ineffectual struggles with French. He proclaimed that not to admire her for her fine mind and liberality of sentiment was impossible, and he breathed a sigh of the most unfeigned relief when she departed. All the court personages felt that they had been having a severe time of it, although the bright and petulant Duchess Amelia was enchanted in the first instance, and wrote to Goethe imploring him to come and study the phenomenon. He resisted for a long while, but finally arrived, not without a previous sneer or two. Madame de Stael was charmed to know him. In fact, her days in Weimar passed in a perfect effervescence of delight. While the Germans were coldly, sometimes rather snarlingly, criticizing her, she was admiring them. Schiller she speaks of with the liveliest enthusiasm. Their acquaintance began with an animated discussion on the respective merits of French and foreign dramas. Madame de Stael maintained that Corneille and Racine were unsurpassable. Schiller, of course, differed, and managed to make her heed his reasons, in spite of his difficulty in speaking French. His quiet simplicity and earnestness, as well as his originality of mind, became instantly manifest to the illustrious stranger. With her, admiration meant always the most ungrudging friendship, and this was the sentiment with which Schiller inspired her for the rest of his days. Goethe she found cold, and she was characteristically disappointed at his no longer displaying the passionate ardor of Werther. "Time has rendered him a spectator," she says, yet she admits the universality of his mind and his prodigious information when once prevailed on to talk. It is provoking to think that she never saw the best of Goethe, and that this disappointing result was, although she was far indeed from guessing it, her own fault chiefly, for she informed the poet that she intended to print his conversation, and of this Goethe had a horror. He states as much in a letter to Schiller, and gives as his reason the sorry figure which Rousseau had cut in his correspondence just then published with Madame de la Tour Franqueville and her friend. The Dowager Duchess Amelia was a vivacious, pleasure-loving, singularly intelligent and liberal-minded woman, who had governed the duchy during her son's minority admirably, and made allies for herself among the best German intellects. Thanks to her, her son Karl August had been so trained that in the midst of a court circle to which the light of the 18th century had barely penetrated, he showed a most manly contempt for the ideals of mistresses of the robes and silver sticks in waiting, and swept all such fripperies away to become the dearest friend of Goethe. His Duchess, whose courage, which both extorted Napoleon's admiration and saved her husband from further proofs of his ire, was a woman of grand character, and as great a contrast, except in what was really best in both of them, to her lively mother-in-law as could well be imagined. She insisted on the most uncompromising observance of etiquette, and wore to the last day of her life the costume which had prevailed in the years when she was young. Of this remarkable trio of exalted personages, it was the reigning Duchess whom Madame de Stael selected for her friend. Indeed, she never mentions the Dowager Duchess in corresponding with the daughter-in-law, and in her Allemagne dismisses the Grand Duke with a few lines in which she alludes to his military talents and speaks of his conversation as piquant and thoughtful. From Weimar, Madame de Stael went to Berlin, with letters from their Highnesses of the little court to the lovely and charming Queen Louise. In a well-known letter to the Grand Duchess, the first of their long correspondence, she records a fête which took place immediately after her arrival. It was a masquerade representing Alexander's return to Babylon, and the beautiful queen, of whom Madame de Stael is lost in admiration, danced in it herself. To this pageant succeeded various costume quadrilles, in which Kotzebue appeared as a priest of Mercury, poppy-crowned, caduceus in hand, so ugly and awkward that Madame de Stael wonders why her imagination was not irretrievably ruined by the sight of him. One likes to think of her at this court, in the midst of such famous and distinguished people, the personages so outwardly brilliant and so inwardly dull, who surrounded her, having vanished down the gulfs of time. Her own unique personality stands out vividly against the picturesque but confused background reconstructed by our fancy. At Berlin she first saw and liked August Wilhelm Schlegel, destined later to be so unwelcome to Sismondi, Bonstetten, and her other friends at Coppet. She succumbed at once to the varied attractions of his colossal learning, his surprising linguistic accomplishments, and his great conversational powers. She felt that here was a foeman worthy of her steel, and she magnanimously overlooked his acerbity, his pedantry, and vanity. She had indeed a royal indifference to the defects of great minds. It was only the greatness she cared for. Berlin was destined to be associated with the greatest, perhaps the most genuine grief of her life. She left it pleased with her reception, enriched with new friends, new experiences, and new ideas. She had been happier there than 6 months previously she would have admitted she could ever be again, far happier than at Coppet, which for years past had been only a place where she tarried and amused herself as she could, until the moment came for returning to Paris. She had treasured up a wealth of conversation for her father, all kinds of novel and delightful impressions which she felt would be listened to by nobody so appreciatively as by him, and she started for Vienna, there to glean a little more. But she had hardly set foot in Austria when a courier brought her the news that her father was dangerously ill. He was, in truth, dead, and the messenger knew it, but the fact was withheld to be broken to her later on. She instantly quitted Vienna, where, as she expresses it, her happiness had ended, and started homewards. On the road her father's death was communicated to her. Her grief was overpowering and demonstrative to the last degree. It was not only sorrow that she felt, but an overmastering terror, for it seemed to her that with her father her last moral support had vanished. Henceforward she would bend to the storms of life like a reed. On arriving at Coppet she sank into a condition that temporarily resembled dementia. The idea that in losing her father her whole existence was irretrievably wrecked from its moorings, and would drift aimlessly in the future, again filled her mind, and this time with greater force. To every remonstrance she only answered, "I have lost my father." She soon recovered, strangely soon, as it seemed to many, her old elasticity and fire, but a curious secret change was wrought in her from the hour of her loss. she showed mystic yearnings, and became even a little superstitious. She invoked her father in her prayers, and nothing deeply agreeable to her ever happened without her saying, "My father has obtained this for me." One of Necker's latest acts was to write a letter to Napoleon begging him to rescind the order for Madame de Staël's exile. Needless to say that the pathetic request had no effect upon the person to whom it was addressed. Domestic sentiment at no time appealed strongly to Napoleon, and at this period he had almost reached his final pitch of unreasoning and arrogant egoism. The murder of the Duc d'Enghien had hardened all his nature, and in preparing to have himself proclaimed emperor, he had kicked away any useless rubbish in the shape of scruples that might still encumber him. Now, when the first germ of decay had begun to consume the core of his splendor, his attitude toward Madame de Staël itself altered. His persecution of her ceased to be a capricious thing compounded of spasmodic spite on his side and sporadic fears on hers, and became an organized system of repression which placed its originator in a light all the meaner that the woman against whom it was directed rose from this time to a new and grander moral attitude. End of Section 15.